The passengers aboard the westbound streamliner pressed their faces to the windows as the train curved into the Carson Range. Morning sun lit the snowmelt rushing down the gullies, turning the water white and fast. The timetable had them running a few minutes behind, but no one cared. It was late spring in Nevada, and most of the riders were tourists, couples headed for Lake Tahoe, families chasing mountain air, salesmen bound for Reno. The rhythmic clatter of wheels against rail made everything feel steady and safe. Near the front of the train, in the second coach, a conductor doing his rounds paused to steady himself as the car jolted harder than expected. He frowned at the window. The bridge over Clear Creek, locals called it the Glenbrook Bridge, was coming up. The crew members knew it as a narrow span of timber and steel that crossed snow-fed water stronger in May than at any other time of year. Maintenance reports earlier that month had warned of minor shifting, but the railway's executives had pushed back against extended closures. Delays hurt tourism, and tourism meant money. The train didn't slow. The engineers saw the problem too late. As the locomotive approached the bridge, water hammered the pilings with a force normally seen mid-thaw, not weeks afterward. A soft rumbling started under the tracks. The lead engineer's hand shot for the brake, but the wheels were already on the span when the first timber snapped with a crack that echoed off the canyon walls. Passengers felt a faint drop, then a violent shudder. Luggage tumbled from overhead racks. Someone screamed as coffee splashed across the aisle. The second crack came louder, followed by the unmistakable sound of metal tearing. The front of the train tilted sharply left. The locomotive plunged first, its weight dragging the tender with it. The first passenger car jackknifed, slamming into the creek bed with such force that its windows exploded outward. The second car twisted off the rails and rolled into the water, filling instantly as icy meltwater blasted through broken glass and openings torn in the frame. People were tossed against seats, walls, and one another as the car spun and struck the rocks. In the rear coaches, passengers felt the jerk but didn't understand what had happened, until they looked ahead and saw only empty space where the rest of the train should have been. The brakes screamed. Cars screeched to a stop on torn rails that ended in midair. Survivors in the overturned coaches fought to find their bearings. The cold of the water shocked their bodies so violently that many couldn't catch their breath. A few managed to crawl out through smashed windows and climb onto the rocky bank, shivering, bloodied, and calling for people who didn't answer. The creek ran high enough that anything swept into the current disappeared downstream in seconds. The conductor who had been checking tickets pulled himself out of a broken doorway with one arm dangling uselessly at his side. He slipped twice on wet stones before reaching a woman trapped under a section of collapsed roof paneling. Her hand reached for him through the debris, then went still. He tried to lift the metal anyway, but it wouldn't budge. Those in the rear cars rushed forward, but stopped at the edge of the gap. The rails hung over the creek like snapped twigs. Smoke rose from the crushed locomotive below. Men formed makeshift chains to pass blankets and rope down the bank. A rancher who'd been traveling home from Carson City tied his belt to a length of rope and lowered himself toward the shattered cars. Despite the warnings from others, he helped pull two dazed passengers to higher ground, both in shock and both convinced more cars were about to fall on them. A telegraph operator among the passengers sprinted back into the intact coaches to find the emergency signaling kit. He tapped out a distress call on a portable key, while others flagged down the first logging truck to appear on the distant road. News of the derailment reached Carson City within the hour. Rescue teams assembled quickly, railway workers, local firefighters, and volunteers from nearby cabins. But the route to the site was rough. It took time to bring stretchers, blankets, and medical supplies down the narrow path carved along the side of the ravine. When they arrived, they found the scene hushed, except for the roar of water and the groans of the injured. Bodies were recovered from the creek bed and from inside the crushed compartments of the front cars. Some were found as far as a mile downstream, caught in snagged branches or lodged against rocks. The youngest victim was a boy who had been traveling with his mother to visit relatives in Reno. Rescuers found his small suitcase unbroken on the bank hours before they found him. As teams worked, a railway official arrived on site, stepping carefully around debris while scribbling notes. He spoke quietly with foreman witnesses, later recalled hearing him emphasize the need for calm and order, stressing that tourism season can't afford panic. Several rescuers bristled. They were still pulling bodies from the wreckage. Reporters reached the area by mid-afternoon. The story they heard from survivors was one of a bridge weakened by spring runoff, with visible shifting in the pilings days before the accident. But the newspapers that hit stands the next morning told a different version. Sudden flooding, unexpected water pressure, an act of nature no one could have foreseen. Headlines downplayed the scale of the collapse. Editorials urged travelers not to fear the mountains or the railroads that served them. Behind the scenes, railway inspectors filed internal memos noting that maintenance crews had flagged structural instability twice in May. Those memos never made it to the public. Managers insisted the bridge had been sound enough and blamed the water, not the neglected repairs. Meanwhile, the company rushed to erect a temporary replacement span to reopen the line as quickly as possible. Families arrived in Carson City throughout the next week to identify the dead. The station master cleared a private room for them, away from the main platform. He later told friends that the silence of those families, the way they stood over the laid-out bodies without speaking, was worse than any sound he'd ever heard on the rails. Survivors dispersed slowly. Some returned home immediately, unable to ride another train. Others stayed in town for days, shaken and angry. A few demanded an inquiry. They received polite letters of acknowledgement and nothing more. The region's tourism boosters pushed travel promotions within days of the derailment, promising scenic views, safe journeys, and fresh mountain air. By summer's end, the disaster had faded from public view. Only a few locals continued to talk about the weakened pilings, the rushed inspections, and the way the newspapers glossed over the details. Those who helped recover the bodies remembered the truth every time they crossed a repaired bridge that stood in the same place as the one that had failed. The Glenbrook derailment never earned a monument. Travelers passing through the area today see the river rushing below a modern span, fast and cold, without knowing what happened there in 1939. But for the people who carried stretchers down that ravine, who searched the water for those swept away, and who saw the wreckage firsthand, the memory never settled quietly. It lived on in the river that had eaten through the bridge's weakened bones, in the silence of the families who came to claim what remained, and in the knowledge that the truth had been buried beneath headlines crafted to protect an industry, not the people who trusted it. Thank you for listening to Road to Ruins. Subscribe for more true stories where systems fail and people pay the price.